Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Tom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast. I'm your host, Thom Jennings. And I want to start by, of course, thanking everybody for listening, for all the feedback, for anyone that takes the time to reach out to me with criticism, constructive criticism. It's just been fantastic, and I can't thank you enough. I am enjoying doing these podcasts. They're certainly a lot of work. They've got a ways to go. I think they're evolving into something that's pretty good. It's hopefully something that you're enjoying. And today is going to be a topic that is a very personal one. Last week, I was working, I was bartending, and some people came in and with their kids, and I think it was one of their kids' girlfriends. So I looked at the two of them and working at a bar, they were coming in to throw axes. Now, if you don't know what throwing axes is, it's literally taking an axe, throwing it at a wood board. A lot of bars and different places have them. And you can throw axes if you're age 16 with parental consent. So we asked, actually before the night began, somebody had, the owner had said to me, we have to be careful, make sure that we're checking IDs, that kind of stuff. I mean, that's something that periodically comes up when you're bartending. And I asked these two young people how old they were, and they said they were 16. And I looked at them, and I just was, I was kind of like, I was in shock. Now I'm 55 years old, which means that it's been 39 years since I was 16 years old. But 16 was a milestone year for me in that I dropped out of high school when I was 16, went to work full time when I was 16. By the time I was 17, I had an apartment with a girlfriend and a child. So when I was 16, I had a child on the way. And I looked at these two young people and I thought to myself, my God, I was young when I had that child. And over the years, in fact, I remember there was when I was going to college, and I didn't go to college, as I may have mentioned on a previous episode, until I was in my early 40s. And one of the professors and I were talking one day, and she was asking me about my life and all these different things. And at that stage of my life, I was a custodial parent of a couple young guys. And actually, I take that back. I went to college in my mid-30s. But at that point, I was divorced. I had two kids. I had custody of them. And she was very fascinated by a lot of that. But she was also fascinated by this concept of being a teen parent. And there's certain things about an individual that define them, who they are. I know that during the period of time where I was a single dad, I mean, that felt like that was the number one title. And it was really what defined me for many years was it because it was kind of unusual for a father to have custody of his kids. But being a teen father was just so weird. And if you listen to the episode that I just did with Robert Harding, one of the things that we discussed in that was fatherhood. Now, the same night that I'd seen the two 16-year-olds, we had another friend that was at the bar, and he's my son's Tom's age, so he's about 33, and he has his first kid on the way. And he was talking with the owner of the bar, who's maybe a little bit older, 37, 38, and about becoming a father and the expectations and the things that happen when you become a father. And he said to me, he says, well, Tom, tell this guy, what it's going to be like when he's dad. I mean, do you remember when you became a dad? And I was like, yeah, I remember when I became a dad. And it's weird because at that point he had asked me that, and it was just after I'd seen these two 16-year-olds with really these, bright eyes and a life ahead of them and all those types of things. And I was like, my goodness. It's been that long. And I think that I tend to gravitate towards people in my life that are are good fathers. And there's a number of reasons for that, because I had a very fractured relationship with my own father. So when I became a dad, and it's really, when I became a dad, I really wanted to be a good dad. It was very important to me. And I think I'd felt like up to that point in my life, even at age 17, that I had pretty much failed at everything. I had a sister who was a straight A student. She went to Cornell University, which is an Ivy League school, and then off to NYU and law school. I had another sister who was admitted to Syracuse University, so she was pretty bright too. And then, I struggled to get D's and C's. I had a hard time even passing classes, and that's when I attended. Eventually I just stopped attending. And there's a bit of irony there, because now I'm a high school teacher. I teach kids in middle school as well, that I try to help kids get their diplomas, because I look back on it now and realize how foolish it was of me not to put more effort into getting a diploma. But the weird thing about the whole my becoming a dad thing is that even at age 16, it was something that for all intents and purposes was planned. And that may seem utterly bizarre because, well, it is. But the situation is that my oldest son, Tim's mother, Janie, her sister, Wendy, who was older by a year or two, and probably still is, had a child in her teen years and was doing okay with it. And it's kind of like with high school dropouts. They always say, we don't really need a high school diploma because look at Albert Einstein. He didn't have a high school diploma and he did all right. And I think there was this notion as a teen parent, I think maybe this still exists to some degree, because even though teen pregnancy has decreased significantly over the years, when you're in it, you look for every justification to prove that there's no reason that a teenager shouldn't have a child. And it really, in my case, it creates a bit of a conflict emotionally, because one of those questions people ask, and it's rhetorical. It really doesn't mean anything because you can't go back and change the past, but people will often ask you, well, if you could change the past, would you have a child at age 17? And honestly, I wouldn't. I love my kid. It's not a reflection on him. It's more of a reflection on the impact that it had on my life. And again, it's a rhetorical question, so it doesn't really matter. But you make decisions when you're 16 years old you don't think are going to reverberate through your entire life, even when you get to the age of 55. But here I am still talking about it 39 years later, and in many ways still feeling the economic effects of it, the stigmas, the difficulties in terms of relationships with females, with my kids, all that kind of stuff. Grandkids. It just, everything that dates back to that time and that particular decision has had consequences, and long-lasting consequences. Much like if you commit a crime at a young age. If somebody commits murder when they're 16, 17 years old, they're likely going to go to prison for a long time. And if they ever get out, it's still going to be the event that defines their entire life. Now, thankfully, I didn't commit murder. I, in fact, was party to creating a child. But nevertheless, it's just was one of those things that, again, when you try to look back at it in retrospect, it really gives you a pause. And in working with youth like I do now, one of the things that I try to impress upon them, because for a long time, especially as a teacher, I hid a lot of my personal life. I hid the fact that I had dropped out of high school. And there was actually an administrator at a school that I worked at that told me specifically, when they had found out that I didn't complete high school traditionally, that I had a GED, that I was not allowed to tell the students. And I guess I kind of got it, because it goes back to that notion where you have kids that say, oh, look at Mr. Jennings. He's got a master's degree and he didn't finish high school. So I don't need to finish high school. And I have a student like that right now that I'm working with. Reminds me a lot of me, except for the kid on the way. Very bright. I'm not saying that I was particularly bright. I mean, in terms of common sense at age 16, I had very little. But it's weird that I had to hide that aspect of my life, as it's just this huge mistake. You know, having a kid at 16 and at 17. And as much as it's a mistake, there's things that came out of it that were okay, right? I have grandkids, and through my oldest son, he's turned out to be a pretty good guy. He's married. He's, for all I know, he's faithful to his wife. And I mean, we don't live close, and we certainly don't have as close a relationship as I wish we would, but it's not like that this kid was born, he became a criminal and a scourge on society, you know? But there was this notion, like I couldn't tell kids that I dropped out of high school or that I had a kid at a certain age. I had to hide that aspect of my personality. And to be fair, I mean, I hid a lot of it for many years. I mean, there was kids talk to me today about the fact that, and I don't hide the fact that I dropped out of high school, and I use it to discuss with kids and say, you know what? When I dropped out of high school and I had a kid, I was able to go find jobs and work in fast food and the restaurant industry, washing dishes, you know, doing what I had to do to pay bills. Because back in those days, employers really didn't care. I mean, you could lie about your age on an application, and in the restaurant industry with what they paid, they were just looking for a warm body. I mean, if you were willing to wash dishes, you could work 60 hours a week easily. And eventually, if you became a line cook, you could do the same thing. So if you're willing to hustle, you could get away with it. Now, things are very different today. It's easier to verify somebody's birth date. I think employers are much more cautious when it comes to hiring workers that are illegal, whether that be because of their age or if they're an alien or whatever. So I kind of got away with it because of the time. I mean, I pulled it off. Not well, but I pulled it off. But the thing is that being a teen dad, it's so much different. I mean, it really changes your perspective on everything with regard to parenting. And I do, as much as I would say, okay, if I go back, I'd change it over again. I'd change everything. I wouldn't do it the same way. I wouldn't have a kid at age 17. I'd finish high school traditionally. I'd go to college at a time that made sense to go to college. All those types of things that I wish I had done. What the teen parenting experience laid the groundwork for me to become a much better parent for my other two kids, which really came out of kind of the ashes of my teen parenting experience. Now, as I've mentioned, I became a dad at 17, and there were so many issues that came up. It's even bizarre for me to kind of wrap my brain around it at times. And I remember the day that my son was born. I was working as a dishwasher at a place called Howard Johnson's. I don't know if they have any more of them in the country, but if you're of a certain age, you might remember them. They were known for having orange roofs and a certain amount of ice cream flavors, and some of them had hotels, and the one I worked at was just a restaurant. So here I am working as the dishwasher at this restaurant. I get a phone call. I got to go to the hospital. I go to the hospital. We had actually gone to birthing classes at 16 years old. Imagine the looks that we received from all the other parents in the birthing class. Because even back then, even though teen pregnancy wasn't as... I don't know if the statistics bear it out. I think I've looked it up in recent years, but I don't think it's as common as it used to be. But back in, my son was born in 1983. It was fairly common back then for teenagers to have kids. I mean, I knew a lot of classmates that had kids. I knew classmates that had kids as young as age 14. So, but nevertheless, we were going to these classes. I would have to take a public transportation, a city bus, because I was not old enough to own a car or drive. So we would go to these, I think they're called Lamaze classes, carrying these pillows on a school bus or a city bus. And we'd get some funky looks. And then we go to the classes and we'd get even more funky looks. And here we were. We're just this young couple, too young to get married, all those types of things, just about to have a baby. And of course, everybody's thinking, oh my God, this kid is going to turn out to be a mess because look at these two young parents and the irresponsible decision that they had made. And speaking of decisions, with really the renewed debate in terms of abortion was a decision that came up twice out of 3 of my kids, and with potentially a very real possibility for one of them. So that's created a whole nother mental conundrum. Now with my oldest son, she was 16, I was 16. A lot of people were kind of putting pressure on us to abort the child. And it was my Catholic faith that was, and it's not like I wasn't like super Catholic. I mean, I'd been confirmed and I went to church on holidays, things like that. But I still felt that connection to the church and certain teachings. Now, this is going to sound silly, but that included not having sex before marriage. I mean, my intent was, before I met my oldest son's mother, to save myself for my wife. That to me was, because that's what my parents told me that they did. Now, I don't know if they did. I don't know if I believe my mom when she was 31 when she got married. And both my mom and dad said that they were each other's first. My dad was a little more elusive when it came to saying whether mom was his first or not. It's weird when you got to think about your parents and sex, isn't it? Even now, it just feels weird. But folks, all of our parents had sex to make us. So anyhow, we were actually getting a lot of pressure. In fact, the high school that I was attending at the time was a very liberal high school. And I remember we had a debate. I had a teacher named Val McPherson, who's still alive. And they were having a high school reunion for the school coming up Memorial Day this year. And we would go to all these different groups and presentations that they tended to lean on the liberal side, because the high school I went to for a while there, I went to 2 high schools. One was kind of progressive, but the second one was very much a hippie school. So I remember going to a presentation on women's rights, because even back in 1983, it had been less than a decade since Roe v. Wade, or maybe it was just around a decade. You can look it up. I should know that because I'm a history teacher, but I don't. So forgive me. Nevertheless, I mean, the whole concept of pro-choice and pro-life, I mean, those weren't really terms that were being used back then. Actually, in 1983, it was really pro-abortion, anti-abortion. I mean, they were very cut and dried. The whole pro-life, pro-choice thing sort of evolved through the political system later on. And so we actually went to Planned Parenthood and had this whole presentation on abortion and the safety of it, things like that. And to my son's mother's credit, it really was never anything that was actually on our radar. I mean, it wasn't something we ever considered seriously. And a lot of that was me being delusional. I don't know if she was necessarily delusional or not, but thinking, what, we can do it. And of course, everybody said too, couples that have kids at 16, 17 years old, I mean, they're not going to last. And we were pretty well convinced that we were going to be together forever. It's, like the, Meatloaf Paradise by the Dashboard Light. It's probably a horrible choice of songs, but we were convinced. I mean, if I had to go back and have a conversation with my 17-year-old self, my 17-year-old self would look at me today and say, no, we'll be fine. We'll stay together. We're never going to split up. So, baby's born. As I mentioned, I get called. I make it through the whole birthing process. And I think anybody that tells you that seeing a child born, either natural or cesarean, is a beautiful thing, I don't know. I'll tell you what's beautiful. What's beautiful is that moment where you get to hold your child and the poor mother is just thoroughly exhausted because they've done all the work. And you as the guy have just sat back and just been really stressed out and seen some crazy stuff. But then you get to hold the kid and you look and you go, wow, like this is a baby. I made this. And it to me, at least, it really gave my life some meaning. And it instantaneously, you take on that title. I mean, you don't have the title of dad until you hold that baby. And I mean, you can make babies and never earn the title of dad. So, I mean, I remember holding my son Tim, and I remember seeing his eyes open for the first time. I mean, everything. That still is a very vivid experience for me. But quickly it turned crazy because in our case, we were in the hospital. I remember now. Janie, who's my oldest son's mother, her mother was, for lack of a better term, she could be very erratic and unpredictable. And at one moment we would be best of friends and she would be really sweet to me, but at other moments she would yell at me and literally for impregnating her daughter, her youngest daughter, and I was the evil incarnate, all that kind of stuff. So the first major obstacle we had as teen parents was that Janie's mother did not want my oldest son Tim to have my last name. She wanted the baby to have Janie's last name. Now, this is a double weird, and I'll tell you why. Because Janie's last name was her mother's ex-husband's last name. It wasn't even her last name, and it wasn't her maiden name. It wasn't anything. That name was not even associated with her, other than the fact that her kid's last name was that, and her ex-husband's last name was that. So I didn't get it. I was pretty upset. And they had this conversation on the other side of this. This is another thing that I remember very vividly, and it being kind of weird. So they had this conversation on the other side of a curtain, as if they were on the other side of a wall. So I literally heard the whole thing as if they were just standing next to me talking to me. So as this is going on, and she said to her daughter, she said, well, you're not bringing that child into my house if it has the last name Jennings. And I mean, think about that. To let that sink in for a minute. It's crazy. So now with all the stereotypes that are out there in the world in terms of fathers that are absentee dads, that don't take responsibility if they impregnate a woman, all that stuff. Here I am in my heart thinking, I did what I needed to do. I dropped out of high school, which in retrospect I didn't have to. I probably could have still worked and earned some money and finished my high school degree. I think that my kid might have been better for it. But I can't change that either. But to make it sound like, my last name somehow changes this kid. It's pretty awful. So that was a traumatic experience on a lot of levels. And I remember as I'm holding him and just really trying to enjoy the moment, holding my less than 2-day-old son, because back in those days you stayed in the hospital for like 3 days. She came back in the room and I just looked at her and I said, I don't get it. Why would you want this kid to have the last name of your ex-husband, as opposed to the guy that actually stuck around, that went to the Lamaze classes, that took responsibility for this kid. I just don't get it. And she just looked at me and she just kind of stormed out. So we wound up, we were living in Rochester, New York at the time, a town called Brighton. And we wound up moving out to Denver because her father, she had lived with her mother who was in Rochester. Her father was in Denver. And so the father said, well, you can come out here. You can come out to Denver. I'll fly you guys out. So I went home to my parents' house. I packed a bag, didn't say a word to either one of them, and snuck out my window in the middle of the night and left. And hopped a plane the next day. Didn't even say goodbye. That's a nervous laugh, by the way. That was a funny thing to do. It was, I literally just took a bag of clothes, and I don't remember taking any other possessions. And so we hopped a plane. It was the first time I ever flew. So the dad flew us out to Denver. And at that point, we got to Denver. We stayed with her sister for a period of time and her sister's husband. And they had a second kid by this point. And so, you got 3 little kids. Actually, no, their second kid had not been born yet. I think she may have been pregnant with the second kid at the time. Whatever the case, her husband, Janie's sister's name was Wendy. Her husband's name was Brian, and he was a police officer. And guy just hated me. He was just a complete jerk to me, like from the minute that he met me. Her parents weren't much better to me, and we went a blasting, I think, another 6 or 7 months, and she got pregnant by another dude. And it's a story I tell. I'm not trying to air anybody's dirty laundry. I mean, you can do the math. She's got 2 kids, 2 different dads that are a year apart. So it's not like you can't figure that out. But I was working so much. I'm working 3 jobs just trying to pay for an apartment in Denver, Colorado. Actually, we were living in the town of Littleton, where they're noted for the Columbine shooting. We were closer to there's 2 schools in Littleton, Colorado. We weren't closer to the Columbine. We were closer to one called Arapahoe. But I definitely had my taste of Littleton, Colorado, and could see where some of that, the preppiness and the things like that sort of drove that shooting. Boy, that would be a weird episode someday. Talk about my experience in Littleton and my observations. So we were there, and then we had her place, and she said to me, she said, well, she told me she was pregnant. And then I said, well, I don't see how you can be, because I was using birth control at the time. And she said, no, it's not yours. So it created a very difficult situation, to put it mildly. Now, her dad came over to the apartment and sat me down, and he had a speech with me. And he said, well, I don't know what you were expecting. My daughter is beautiful. She can have any man that she wants. You are just some high school dropout that's not even that good looking. So my suggestion is going to be this. You need to go back to New York by your family. Forget about my daughter. Forget about the kid. And do something with your life. That's what the guy said to me. So he went up, him and her brother stood over me while I packed all my stuff, because basically if I didn't pack my stuff, they were going to beat the crap out of me. So I packed all my stuff. They took me to a Greyhound bus station. The only thing they didn't let me take was my money that I'd earned. So I literally had no money. This was back in the days before you had like ATM cards or anything like that. So I had no money. I'm in a bus station, and I stayed in that bus station for 3 days, bumming quarters and change so that I could eat like bags of chips. There was that nervous laugh again, folks. And trying to convince my mom or my dad to pay for a ticket for me to come home. And so my dad would not give the message to my mom, because I knew my mom would do it, but my dad didn't like me. So he wasn't going to do it. And then he wouldn't give the message to my mom. And if I remember correctly, and granted, this is 40 years ago, and sometimes memories are a little bit odd. I think what had happened is that, back before we had cell phones, there was a home phone and then a work phone, and my mom worked, my dad didn't. So I had to wait until Monday to call her at work. So I'm pretty sure that they must have dropped me off at the bus station on a Friday and had to stay there through the weekend. And it's sad too, because at that point, I think I'd lived in Denver for 5 months, maybe 6 months. And I didn't really have a friend that I could call. I was so caught up in just trying to survive and live and make money to pay the rent and for food and all that stuff. I mean, we didn't have access to food stamps or any of these programs. I mean, but as crazy as it seems, you could still string together enough money to get an apartment and sign a lease. And of course, I lied about my age on the lease because I wasn't even of legal age to sign a lease. So, I came back to New York, and that was probably the second lowest point in my life in terms of just feeling like a failure, feeling like I had nowhere to go. At that point, I had been gone long enough, and 6 months doesn't seem like a long time, but you come back and all my high school friends had kind of moved on. They were doing their own thing. They didn't really want to have anything to do with me at that point. I didn't really have a place to live. I mean, I could stay at my parents' house for a period of time, but my dad freaking hated me, and he did everything in his power to make life difficult on me. So I had to figure out a place to live. I had to find employment, all that stuff. So, pretty horrible portion of my life. Well, now, Janie and I eventually got back together, even though she was pregnant with the other kid. I could tell stories about that too, but it just, in fact, I was listening to Jay Leno the other day, and he was talking about Will Smith and the whole slap incident, which we've already mentioned in a previous episode in the podcast. And he says, obviously there's some other stuff going on with Will Smith, that he slapped Chris Rock. And I think a lot of it goes back to this whole concept of open marriage. I don't think open marriages work. And I am of the mindset that I think it's difficult, if not impossible, to get past infidelity in relationships. It just really is. And I think that there's some people that just aren't necessarily made to be faithful. It's just who they are. It's their makeup. I don't know if you want to chalk it up to sex drive, if it's thrill seeking, you can call it what you want. There's just some people that aren't going to be faithful. And maybe in some ways they're chasing that emotion that you get in the early phases of a relationship, which is pretty wonderful. In most cases. I mean, being in love is an amazing feeling. It's intoxicating. It's great when you're in it, but it can be an emotional roller coaster. But like anything, it kind of fades. So if you're really gonna, people say, oh, we want to rekindle a relationship, things like that. Sometimes relationships just can't be rekindled. But the thing that's the hardest to rebuild is trust. And so as much as I really wanted to be able to trust or possibly be a dad and maybe understand that we were both young, we both made mistakes and all those kind of things, it was just doomed. It just wasn't going to work at that. I mean, pregnant with another dude's kid, it's just not. How do you get past that? I don't know. If you can come up with a solution to that one, you let me know. And I'm sure there's somebody in the world that did it, but not this guy. And I think most people will agree with me that once you have that major betrayal, it's difficult. I mean, I had a friend that his wife actually was pregnant and he didn't even know it. And she gave birth, went into labor in a Walmart, and then was taken to the hospital, gave birth to the child. And the child was a different race than the father or the mother. So it wasn't even like there was any chance of saying that somehow she was pregnant by this guy. And then she came up with the story that she had been raped and, all this other stuff. And I don't know. This day, I don't believe the story. And I don't think anybody with any common sense would believe it because there were just too many holes in the story. But he stayed with her. He stayed with her and he took care of that child. And it lasted for, 2.5, 3 years. And then he actually wound up getting the kid along with the child that they had together before that. But the marriage fell apart because it really just comes down to now, if my wife had been, or girlfriend was truly raped and impregnated by another person, I'd work through it. I'd do what I have to do. I mean, that's not a betrayal. So, anyhow, things being what they were, she had the second kid. I think it was about maybe 2 years in. At some point, she had decided that she was going to go and do something. And Tim was living with me, so I was a single dad around 18, 19 years old. And then her other kid, a kid named Danny, went to go live with this guy, his dad. It was a guy named Gary. And Gary lived in Illinois. I don't know how they actually met him. I know she met him in Denver, but somehow he wound up back in Illinois, kind of like I wound up back in New York. And obviously a lot of things happened in between that time, and but I don't know that. I mean, I probably bored most people already in terms of this story. But so I had the kid, my kid, he had his kid, and Janie was off doing whatever she was doing. And I enjoyed it. But to be honest, I mean, it was like at 19 years old, being a dad, I was bartending and relentlessly pursuing women. I mean, I loved women. I mean, I wasn't a male whore per se, but I loved to date. And Tim, who was my son, was excellent bait. It sounds horrible, but it's true. Because you'd have these young women, they would come over and they would see this little blonde kid with the blue eyes, and they go, "Oh my God, he lives with you!" Oh, so it would be a great way to get girls to come over to my apartment and for a couple of dates or whatever. But I did find, and I found this out later in life when I was a dad that was not necessarily in the relentless pursuit of women, but just a dad with a couple of kids, single dad with a couple of kids, that as much as guys get grief for not liking dating women with kids, women don't like dating dudes with kids either. They really don't. So Tim was a great icebreaker, I suppose was for lack of a better term. I'm working in the restaurant industry. I have these beautiful waitresses. They come over and they meet Tim and they'd play with him and they'd like to do the whole motherly thing, in short bursts. But man, they didn't want to commit to it. Like, they just wanted a boyfriend that was going to spend money on him, buy dinner with him, or take him to concerts or any of that kind of stuff. And when you have the responsibility of a child, and at that point I didn't really have a relationship with my parents, so it's not like my parents were helping me babysit him or anything like that. It was a deal breaker when it came to a lot of relationships. So just doing what, but I was doing what I was doing. I was getting by. I enjoyed the dad thing. It was, there were some weird parenting decisions that a 19-year-old makes that a 33-year-old dad's probably not going to make. For example, we used to sit around and we'd order pizza like all the time. I had two male roommates, and one of my male roommates was a little bit older, a guy named Ted, and he didn't mind watching Tim if I had to work and things like that. So he kind of helped me out, but we'd sit around, smoke cigarettes and drink Jenny beer and eat pizza and listen to music and all that kind of stuff. So Tim always wanted to be one of the crew. So, by the time he was 3 years old, we were taking beer bottles and washing them out and filling them up with milk so that he could sit around and drink milk with us. And then we'd get him candy cigarettes so he could sit around and pretend to smoke cigarettes with us. Now, I don't know if Child Protective in 2022 would necessarily see any of these practices as being very good in terms of parenting, but 19-year-old parents aren't, as I said, the ones that necessarily think with a whole lot of logic. And I certainly wasn't thinking with a lot of logic in those days at all. I mean, if I went to my kid's house and his kid was drinking out of a beer bottle that had been washed out with milk, I don't know how I'd feel about it. I might be like, wow, I used to do that with your older brother or something, but it's not a good idea. And I think society obviously has moved on in terms of even the acceptance of cigarette smoke. I mean, we smoke cigarettes around kids all the time. It really wasn't a big deal. So, that went on for a while. So one day I get a phone call, and it's Gary, who's the father of the younger kid, Danny, the one that was born a year after my son, Tim. And Gary has hatched this wonderful plot. And this plot is to file 2 custody actions, one in New York State where Tim was staying with me, and one in Illinois where Danny was staying with him. And he says, listen, Janie's in Denver, Colorado. You're in New York. I'm in Illinois. She's going to have to appear if we file these court cases. There's no way she's going to run all the way across the country to fight any of this stuff. So this will give us an opportunity to solidify custody for us. And if we combine the actions at the same time, she's going to be stuck. So I thought, wow, it's a great idea. And of course, I'm trusting this guy, Gary, because, yeah. So here you go. So here's the conversation I would have with my 17-year-old self. So Tom, this guy calls you up, and he knew that your girlfriend had a kid with you, and he was sleeping with her anyway. So now you want to trust him to help you out. Yeah. Sounds like a great idea. So I fell for it. I fell for it hook, line, and sinker. At the time, I really didn't think it was a bad idea. In fact, he really sold it well. And the thing with Gary is Gary was significantly older. I think he was in his 30s at the time, which means that he was committing statutory rape as well when he was with Tim's mother. But whatever. So it's probably people listening to this episode going, "My God, I should get paid because I am this man's therapist. This is not a podcast. This is just Tom confessing." It's not really. Anyhow, hopefully this is an interesting story on some level, because I feel like the real stories are the ones that are interesting. So, but yeah, you must do that sometimes, where you just look back and you go, what the hell was I thinking in that situation? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And so, the world would be a better place if we had, if we could, just maybe for a year, maybe just pick a year where our current 50 some odd year old self could go back and talk to one of our selves, like a 14 self or a 15 self or whatever. I'm sure they've made movies about that. So, so it worked out really well for Gary, because I think he had the financial resources to file a decent court case and all that kind of stuff. Did not work out well for me. I had 2 things that were going against me. Is I had kind of a crazy roommate. I was having a difficult situation with him, and we got into some legal trouble because this guy that was supposed to be paying our rent, me and my other roommate were giving him the money for the rent, and the money wasn't going to the landlord. So the landlord called us up and says, oh, you're X amount of money behind. I'm going to have to start eviction proceedings. And, my dumb self says, well, that's not possible because I've been paying Chris the rent the entire time that we've been here. And so he's like, well, you might have been paying Chris, but Chris hasn't been paying me. So here I am. I got potentially a legal action to secure custody of my kid. And Gary's got his thing going on, but evidently he's smart enough to have finished high school and made good decisions with his life, as my 4-year-old granddaughter says. he made good choices. Whereas Papa, back when he was 19, made poor choices. So I'm on the brink of not having a place to live. And I think Janie just realized that if she was going to go for one of the two kids, she would go for Tim, the oldest of the two, because she had the best chance of getting him. And she did. So, it's like here's the dichotomy, because at age, I don't know if I was 17 to 4, so yeah, I'm probably pushing 21 around this time or whatever by the time this all shakes out, and so I'll be 21 years old. I mean, I don't have the responsibility of the kid anymore. I mean, you might think on some level that's really cool, like, oh, finally, I'm 21 years old, I can go out and party and do all the things that I want to do and not be burdened by being a dad. And I'll be honest with you, I don't get it. Like, I don't get the guys that are out there that just don't want that responsibility. So I lost custody of Tim right around his 4th birthday. I think it was very, very soon after his 4th birthday, if I remember correctly. And so he would have turned, I think he turned 4 in that September. It means maybe I don't know, 2 or 3 months after that. And it was pretty awful. And my initial reaction is Janie came to get him. She was with a guy that she eventually married. I mean, and wound up being my son's stepfather. So they showed up at my parents' house. We made arrangements for them to pick Tim up at the parents' house, because at that point, like, I was like living on couches with a 4-year-old kid. For all intents and purposes, I was homeless. So really the only place that we could do the exchange was at my parents' house, and my mom agreed to do it. And so I remember them showing up, and I didn't even go to the door. I just said goodbye to him, and he was gone and went to Denver. And over the next, 15 years, maybe longer, it's about 14, 15 years, very rarely saw him. Very rarely. But in that particular instance, I remember the knee-jerk reaction I had was I wound up like scraping together like $100, which back in 1983 was a lot of money, of tip money. And really wasn't that hard to save money when you're homeless. And you didn't have to pay rent for a little while. So I actually spent time living in the back of a Chevy Chevette, which Chevy Chevettes are not a comfortable place to live in. But I remember I got $100 worth of cocaine. That was the last time I ever did cocaine, by the way. And I did it all in one night, and broke into my old apartment, smashed a bunch of glass on the floor for whatever reason, stripped naked and rolled around in the glass, cutting myself up to shreds as if it was some kind of pain ritual, And years later, I work with kids. I don't know that cut themselves. Okay, it's a thing, and I think it's one of those things that a lot of people don't understand. And one of the reasons I do understand it is because ultimately, I think people confuse the act of cutting with an act of suicide. People are trying to kill themselves, but there's a big difference between somebody that's a self-harmer and somebody that's suicidal. Because the whole self-harming has to do with the fact that if you've shifted your pain centers from the emotional center to the physical center, that it creates some relief. It's the same concept of drugs. You're doing drugs to alter your mind so you're not thinking about the things that have devastated you. It's not an effective way of dealing with problems. Getting naked and rolling around in a bunch of glass and cutting yourself up is not an effective way either. And the fact that I didn't get arrested for breaking and entering and vandalism and all that stuff is miraculous in and of itself. But I remember that, again, as being the total low point in my life. And in some ways it was good because, you really have only two ways to go after a situation like that. You're either going to start getting up because you've hit rock bottom, or you're going to die. And obviously I didn't die, so here I am. And I did kind of crawl out of the mess of that. And I want to make some more messes afterward, which may be a topic of another podcast episode or whatever. But yeah, that was pretty awful. That was a pretty awful time. And it's like, I don't understand how kids can lose kids. I don't understand how people can lose kids, like physically, like children that die at a young age. But I think the difference between, and I've had this discussion too, in terms of the difference between losing a spouse to death and losing a spouse to divorce. I mean, if you divorce a spouse, they're still around. It's like the pain still exists. And then the questions still linger, because you say, what could I have done to have saved this marriage? And what could I have done to have saved, my opportunity to become a dad, or to be a dad for a period of time. So it was pretty awful. And for a lot of years, I really was not, I really avoided Tim's mom, and because it was just such a source of pain. I don't really blame her anymore. I mean, I did for a lot of years, but it was, looking at those 16-year-old kids kind of coming back to the beginning, it was just, I think that's what puts it in perspective. And having this realization that, you make decisions and you do things at a young age that they're not necessarily logical. I mean, you think a lot differently when, people joke that, and I think there's a lot of validity to it, that you wish that you had your 16-year-old body with your 55-year-old brain. That's not to say that at 55 years old, I make a ton of better decisions. Trust me, I still make plenty of really bad ones. But in terms of, relationships, things like that, not my wife. I do love my wife, as I've mentioned before, and I say that with all sincerity. But, if there's anything that interesting that came out of it, is that, my son he lives in Colorado, so I don't really see him. And he's got 3 kids, and they're my 3 grandkids. I've met 2 of them. I haven't even met the third. Met his wife a couple times. Beautiful lady. But for a lot of years, I just, he wanted to have kids late in life. I think he was late 20s, early 30s. And he was, I think there was a period of time that he kind of felt that I was this absentee dad, that I, didn't do enough to be a part of his life or whatever. And maybe there's some truth to that. I don't know. There's not a lot of truth to it, if there's truth to it. But he said to me, I think it was about a month ago, he said to me, because his kids were one of his kids right around the age that he was when I lost custody of him. He says, I was just thinking today that I can't even imagine what you went through when I was taken away from you at that age. Like, I couldn't imagine losing one of my kids at that age, and what it must have done. And it's funny because I think I waited 30 years to hear that. I needed to hear that. It was a strangely healing moment in my life. Because again, it's, in as much as you can look back on your life and say, wow, I was a kid back then, he's made dumb decisions. But you're still, 16-year-old you is still you. It's still, 55-year-old you is still you, that at your core, you're still who you are. And you're still the person that always has the propensity to make those good decisions, the bad decisions. You can learn from your mistakes. You can continue to make some mistakes. I mean, all those types of things are just those challenges, But that was a pretty poignant moment. It really was. And, I think it's, if there's any takeaways from today's particular episode, beyond the fact that you've had to listen to this semi-dark chapter of my life, that there comes a time where you really just have to be able to reconcile with your past. You got to look at it for what it is. You have to accept it for what it is. And you got to come to terms with the fact that you can't change it. And I mean, I know people use terms like, things happen for a reason. If this hadn't happened, this didn't happen, this didn't happen. I mean, but that can go both ways. That can go good, that can go bad. But there is, as I said, I really believe that there's a level of importance of just kind of not repressing, not ignoring, and again, kind of coming to the acceptance of one's own personal fallibility. And a lot of that is just the basis for recovery programs when it comes to alcohol, drugs, those types of things. And even personal and spiritual religious journeys, I think, all have components of being able to kind of go back into your past and analyzing it. And in analyzing it, even just being able to look back at it and go, well, I was a freaking idiot, and not necessarily, I don't know. I guess that's it. I feel like I'm just going in circles right now, like a bagel, circular logic. So I hope you enjoyed this episode on some level. And didn't find it too disturbing. But thanks for listening. Next show we'll have a guest. He's a great one. Good friend of mine, Jim Snyder. I know it's going to be an enjoyable one. And believe me, if I ever run for political office, folks, I've just given them a lot of ammo to use against me, if they can find it. Thanks for listening to the Bagel Logic Podcast. This is your host, Thom Jennings. Deep breath. Thanks for listening.